situation there? Let's bring in foreign policy expert Christian Whiton. He is a former State Department senior advisor for the George W. Bush administration, currently a principal with D.C. International Advisory. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here, Heather.
So the question, how would the Reagan administration have handled the situation in Egypt any differently? Reagan, of course, familiar with Mubarak. He worked with him when he first took office after the assassination of Anwar Sadat.
Yeah, I think Ronald Reagan would have undoubtedly been on the side of the pro-democracy protesters we're seeing on the streets of Cairo and other Middle Eastern cities. He just believed in freedom that much. We just saw footage from the Reagan Library of the Berlin Wall, one of the more famous episodes of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. He went to West Germany, stood on the free side of the Berlin Wall, and invited then Russian President Gorbachev to come to this wall and tear down this wall. He believed in the transformative effects, the positive effects of freedom, not just because it was consistent with our principles, but also because it makes the world safer for the United States to have more free people in more free countries.
You just mentioned tear down this wall. 4 words changed the world, helping to end communism and, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Those words pretty straightforward, unlike President Obama's initial words to Hosni Mubarak calling for an orderly transition. Did Obama do the right thing initially?
No, and Ronald Reagan also believed in being somewhat concise in foreign policy, especially the big goals. And he knew what was really behind the threats we faced. He had spent the better part of 3 decades before he took office in 1981 thinking about the threat from Russia, not just its more apparent manifestations like the Red Army in Eastern Europe, the Red Army in Afghanistan, ICBMs, but understood what drove it, the communist ideology, and he understood that ultimate victory meant undermining communism. But in the same way, not only President Obama, but his predecessor in the White House have not really made the same analogy of our current conflict. We haven't identified Islamism as the chief thing that unites groups from al-Qaeda to the Islamic Brotherhood to Hezbollah, nor have we figured out how to fight it. And President Obama, the Obama administration, saying that it would be fine for the Muslim Brotherhood to be part of a future Egyptian government shows that our Washington foreign policy establishment really doesn't understand today's threats the way Ronald Reagan used to.
And while, of course, President Reagan had dramatic successes, there still remain some questions regarding his policies with South Africa and apartheid. He maintained a constructive engagement policy. Are there lessons to be learned from that in dealing with Egypt?
There are. President Reagan was a very principled person, but he was not a Boy Scout, nor should we want our presidents to be Boy Scouts. One analogy, the Philippines was run by an autocrat, and we partnered with that autocrat, Ferdinand Marcos, out of necessity because the bigger objective we were working toward was the defeat of communism. But we still, always behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes, put pressure on Marcos to reform politically, to liberalize. And then when the Filipinos took to the streets to demand his ouster, we helped facilitate that ouster. So you can work with unsavory characters, and unfortunately often you have to do that in diplomacy, but keeping your eyes on the bigger picture, which at that point was the defeat of communism, and at this point ought to be the defeat of Islamism. And keep your eye on that ball and you'll do okay, and I think Ronald Reagan knew that. So
obvious from the ceremony held today. Ronald Reagan followed words with action. He believed in being clear, famously called for the Soviet Union, called it an evil empire. Pretty clear words. Do you think Obama's problem is that he appears to waver, or was that necessary in the initial stages of the revolution going on in Egypt?
Well, there was tremendous wavering at first. Then the president came out and said a few positive things about democracy and freedom, but he has no credibility on that issue, and actions have not been followed with words. You can't say that and then turn around later and say that the Muslim Brotherhood ought to be welcomed into an Egyptian government. You can't welcome people into your political system who want to destroy that political system unless you're willing to have it be destroyed. Reagan backed up his rhetoric against the Soviet Union. We supported freedom movements in the Eastern Bloc. We supported solidarity in Poland. We fielded a 600-ship Navy, strategic defense initiative, missile defenses, all sorts of other things. So when President Obama, and frankly before him when President George W. Bush, say nice things about democracy, people around the world judge us on our actions, not on our words. And frankly, actions haven't followed words as they did under the Reagan administration.
All right, Christian Whiton, thank you for joining us. Lots of interesting thoughts. What may have been.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.